In a quiet, suburban neighborhood nestled between rolling hills and tree-lined streets, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. The houses were neat, the lawns manicured, and the residents mostly kept to themselves. It was the kind of place where people exchanged polite smiles during evening walks but rarely ventured beyond surface-level conversations. For John Anderson, this peaceful setting seemed perfect. After 20 years of serving in the U.S. Army as a combat engineer, he had earned the right to enjoy some calm after decades of chaos. John wasn't your typical suburban dad. Sure, he mowed his lawn on weekends and waved hello to neighbors, but there was something about him that set him apart from everyone else. For one, he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence, his posture straight, his gaze steady. Those who knew him well understood why. John had spent 2 decades building bridges under enemy fire, diffusing explosives, and leading teams through some of the most dangerous missions imaginable. But when he came home, he left all of that behind. He didn't talk much about his time in the military, preferring instead to focus on his hobbies and rebuilding his life. Among those hobbies was restoring old military vehicles, a passion that stemmed from his childhood fascination with history. His pride and joy was a decommissioned M41 Walker Bulldog tank, a relic from the mid-20th century that weighed a staggering 15 tons. Over the course of several years, John had painstakingly restored the olive-green behemoth to working condition. Every bolt tightened, every scratch buffed out, and every mechanical issue resolved, all done with his own hands. To John, the tank wasn't just a machine, it was a symbol of resilience, a reminder of the grit and determination required to overcome challenges. Despite its intimidating size and weight, John treated the tank like any other collector's item. He kept it parked in his oversized garage, only bringing it out for special occasions. Sometimes he'd take it to local parades or charity events where kids would climb excitedly onto its tracks while parents snapped photos. The tank became a conversation starter, a way for John to connect with others without having to delve into the darker parts of his past. Still, he made sure to respect the rules of his homeowners association, HOA. He never drove the tank around the neighborhood unnecessarily, knowing full well how disruptive it could be. Life in the cul-de-sac had been relatively drama-free until Karen moved in across the street. She arrived with her silver SUV, designer sunglasses perched atop her perfectly styled hair, and an attitude that screamed, "I'm in charge here." From the moment she unpacked her moving boxes, Karen began making waves. She introduced herself to each neighbor personally, armed with copies of the HOA guidelines and a clipboard filled with notes. Her enthusiasm for enforcing rules bordered on obsessive. Within weeks, she had sent letters to 3 different households complaining about everything from overgrown hedges to mismatched curtains. At first, John tried to avoid crossing paths with Karen. He figured that if he stayed low-key and followed the rules, she wouldn't bother him. Unfortunately, fate had other plans. One sunny Saturday morning, John returned home from running errands to find Karen's SUV parked squarely in front of his driveway. At first glance, it looked innocent enough, just another car taking up space. But as John pulled closer, he realized the problem. Her vehicle was positioned so precisely that there was no way for him to maneuver his truck into the driveway without scraping against hers. Frustrated but unwilling to cause a scene, John got out of his truck and walked over to Karen, who was busy watering plants on her porch. "Excuse me," he said politely, trying to keep his tone light. "Your car is blocking my driveway." Karen barely glanced up from her gardening. "Oh, I'll move it when I'm done," she replied dismissively. "This spot gets better. Cell reception." John blinked, unsure whether he'd heard her correctly. Better cell reception? Was she serious? He opened his mouth to protest, but decided against it. Arguing wouldn't solve anything, so he opted to wait patiently. 10 minutes passed, then 20. 30 minutes later, Karen still hadn't budged. By now, John's initial frustration had turned into simmering anger. Finally, unable to stand it any longer, he honked his horn, not aggressively, just loud enough to get her attention. Karen shot him a glare, but eventually climbed into her SUV and drove off. As John backed his truck into the driveway, he noticed something taped to his garage door. It was a note written in bold, capitalized letters. "Next time, try being less rude." John sighed deeply as he crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash. Little did Karen know, her actions were just the beginning of what would become an unforgettable chapter in their otherwise sleepy neighborhood. And while John had always prided himself on staying level-headed, even he couldn't predict how far things would escalate, or how his prized tank would play a starring role in the showdown to come. The first clash between John and Karen set the tone for what was to come, though neither of them realized it at the time. What started as a minor inconvenience quickly escalated into something far more personal. For John, it wasn't just about the blocked driveway, it was about respect. And for Karen, it wasn't just about finding better cell reception, it was about control. Their personalities clashed like two opposing forces, each unwilling to back down. After that initial incident, Karen's behavior grew increasingly brazen. Over the next few weeks, she seemed to make it her mission to park as close to John's driveway as possible, almost daring him to say something. Sometimes her silver SUV would be angled awkwardly across the curb, leaving barely enough room for John's truck to squeeze by. Other times, she'd leave it parked directly in front of his garage, claiming vague reasons like waiting for a delivery or checking my GPS. No matter the excuse, the message was clear. Karen didn't care about inconveniencing John, and she certainly didn't plan on changing her ways anytime soon. John tried to handle the situation diplomatically. Each time he found Karen's car blocking his access, he approached her with calmness and courtesy. "Excuse me," he'd say, keeping his voice even. "Could you please move your vehicle? It's blocking my driveway." At first, Karen acted surprised, as if she hadn't noticed. "Oh, I'll get to it in a minute," she'd reply, waving him off dismissively. But as the days went on, her responses became less polite and more condescending. One particularly frustrating afternoon, John returned home after a long day at work to find Karen standing beside her SUV, scrolling through her phone. His driveway was completely blocked again. Tired and irritable, John walked over to address the issue. "Karen," he said firmly, "this has happened several times now. Please don't park in front of my driveway." Karen looked up from her phone, her expression dripping with smugness. "What's the big deal?" she asked, shrugging. "I'm only here for a few minutes. You can wait." "I've been waiting," John replied, his patience wearing thin. "Every time I come home, your car is in the way. It's not fair to me, or anyone else who needs to use their driveway." Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "You know, maybe if you weren't so uptight, people wouldn't mind parking here. Honestly, it's just a driveway. Stop making such a fuss." Her words stung, but John bit his tongue. He knew arguing wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he stood there silently, hoping she'd take the hint and move her car. After what felt like an eternity, Karen finally climbed into her SUV and drove away, but not before muttering under her breath about how entitled some people could be. Word of these encounters began spreading through the neighborhood. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, speculating about the growing tension between John and Karen. Some sympathized with John, knowing how hard-working and reserved he was. Others thought Karen was being unreasonable, especially since she had plenty of space in her own driveway. Still, no one dared intervene. Karen had a reputation for being difficult, and most residents preferred to avoid conflict rather than risk becoming her next target. Amidst all this, rumors about John's tank started circulating. People had heard whispers about the massive military vehicle stored in his garage, but few had actually seen it. Some dismissed the stories as exaggerations, assuming John simply owned a model or a replica. Others believed the rumors but doubted he'd ever bring the tank out onto the street. After all, who would do something so extreme just to prove a point? Karen, however, remained skeptical. She scoffed at the idea of John owning a real tank, convinced it was nothing more than a fabrication designed to intimidate her. "He's probably bluffing," she told a neighbor one afternoon while sipping iced tea on her porch. "If he really had a tank, he'd have used it by now. Trust me, it's all talk." Unbeknownst to Karen, her dismissive attitude only fueled John's determination to stand his ground. While he didn't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily, he also refused to let her trample over his rights. Every time she parked in front of his driveway, she was sending a message. This is my territory and you'll play by my rules. But John wasn't the type of person to bow to intimidation, not in his personal life and certainly not in his neighborhood. As the weeks dragged on, the tension between them simmered just below the surface, threatening to boil over at any moment. John continued going about his daily routine, trying to ignore Karen's antics as best he could. Yet deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was brewing. The blocked driveway was more than just an inconvenience. It was a test of wills, and sooner or later someone would have to blink. Little did Karen realize her constant provocations were pushing John closer to a decision he'd been avoiding, a decision that would change everything. For now, though, life in the cul-de-sac carried on as usual, with neighbors pretending not to notice the brewing storm. But beneath the surface, the quiet neighborhood was teetering on the edge of chaos. As the days turned into weeks, Karen's behavior grew bolder and more calculated. It was as if she had declared an unspoken war against John, using her SUV as a weapon to assert dominance over his property. Her actions became less about convenience and more about flexing her perceived authority within the neighborhood. Every time John returned home, he found Karen's silver SUV strategically positioned in front of his driveway, sometimes angled slightly to block access, other times parked, dead center without any attempt to disguise her intentions. At first, John chalked it up to coincidence or carelessness. But after the 10th time it happened, he realized this wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. The excuses Karen offered ranged from flimsy to outright absurd. One day, she claimed she needed to test her car's alignment by parking at odd angles near his driveway. Another time, she said she was waiting for a phone call that required perfect reception, a claim she repeated so often that even some of her own neighbors began rolling their eyes behind her back. Yet no matter how ridiculous her reasons sounded, Karen never apologized or showed any remorse for inconveniencing John. What made matters worse was her smug demeanor whenever they interacted. Instead of acknowledging her mistakes, Karen seemed to relish the opportunity to belittle John further. On one occasion, when John politely asked her to move her car yet again, she smirked and said, "You know, veterans are supposed to be patient. Maybe you should try channeling some of that military discipline instead of complaining all the time." Her comment hit a nerve. For someone like John, who had spent 2 decades sacrificing comfort, safety, and personal freedom to serve his country, being lectured about patience by someone like Karen felt like a slap in the face. He clenched his fists momentarily, fighting the urge to snap back. But years of training had taught him the value of restraint, so he simply nodded, turned around, and walked back to his house. Still, the remark lingered in his mind long after the conversation ended. Was Karen intentionally trying to provoke him? Or did she genuinely believe she was superior because of her self-appointed role as the HOA enforcer? The tension between them didn't go unnoticed by the rest of the neighborhood. Neighbors whispered among themselves, torn between amusement and exasperation. Some admired John's calmness under pressure, while others wondered why he didn't put Karen in her place sooner. A few brave souls even approached John privately to offer their support. "She's impossible," one neighbor confided during a casual chat over the fence. "I've lived here for 5 years and she's been nitpicking my yard since day one. Don't let her get to you." John appreciated their concern but shrugged it off with a wry smile. "It's fine," he'd say lightly. "I'm used to dealing with difficult people." What he didn't mention was that Karen's antics were starting to wear on him, not because of the inconvenience itself, but because of what it represented. To John, this wasn't just about a blocked driveway anymore. It was about respect, boundaries, and standing up for oneself when those lines were crossed repeatedly. Meanwhile, rumors about John's tank continued to swirl throughout the neighborhood. At first, they were met with skepticism. After all, how many people could honestly say they owned a 15-ton military vehicle? But as the stories persisted, curiosity turned into intrigue. Kids playing outside would sometimes ask their parents if the rumors were true. "Does Mr. Anderson really have a tank?" They'd wonder aloud, their eyes wide with excitement. Adults, too, couldn't help but speculate. If anyone can pull it off, it's probably him, one neighbor joked during a weekend barbecue. He's got that whole military guy vibe going on. Karen, however, remained unconvinced. She dismissed the tales as exaggerations or outright fabrications meant to scare her into submission. "Please," she scoffed to anyone who brought it up. "A tank in his garage? That's ridiculous. Even if he does have one, it's probably just a toy or something. No way is he driving it around the neighborhood." Her dismissive attitude only added fuel to the fire, though. Deep down, she must have known there was a kernel of truth to the rumors. Otherwise, why bother denying them so vehemently? Unbeknownst to Karen, her constant provocations were slowly pushing John toward a decision he'd been avoiding. While he valued peace and harmony in the neighborhood, he also understood the importance of setting boundaries. Allowing Karen to park in front of his driveway repeatedly sent a message, not just to her but to everyone else, that such behavior was acceptable. And John knew better than most that ignoring small issues often led to bigger problems down the line. One evening, as John sat on his porch sipping coffee, he reflected on the situation. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac. From where he sat, he could see Karen's SUV parked neatly in her driveway. For once, not obstructing his. But instead of feeling relief, John felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Tomorrow, or the day after, Karen would inevitably find another excuse to park in front of his house. And when that happened, John wanted to be prepared. His gaze drifted toward the garage, where the M41 Walker Bulldog tank lay dormant, its olive green frame barely visible through the partially open door. John had always viewed the tank as a symbol of strength and resilience, a reminder of the challenges he'd overcome in life. Now, it took on a new meaning, a tool to reclaim his dignity and protect his space. He hadn't joined the army to intimidate civilians, nor did he plan on using the tank recklessly. But if Karen refused to respect his boundaries, perhaps it was time to remind her and everyone else exactly who she was dealing with. For now, John kept his thoughts to himself. He finished his coffee, stood up, and headed inside. The quiet hum of the neighborhood enveloped him as he closed the door behind him. Outside, the streets remained peaceful, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. But deep down, John knew the calm wouldn't last forever. Something had to give, and when it did, the entire neighborhood would feel the impact. The breaking point came on a chilly evening, one of those nights where the air felt heavy with tension and the sky was painted in shades of gray. John had spent the day running errands, picking up supplies for his latest project, a restoration job on an old Jeep he'd recently acquired. It was something he enjoyed doing in his downtime, a way to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. But as he turned onto his street that evening, the sight waiting for him at the end of the cul-de-sac made his blood boil. There it was again, Karen's silver SUV, parked squarely in front of his driveway. This time, however, there was no mistaking her intent. The car wasn't just blocking access. It was positioned so deliberately that even if John tried to squeeze past, he risked damaging both vehicles. And to make matters worse, Karen wasn't anywhere in sight. Her absence spoke volumes. She knew exactly what she was doing, leaving her SUV as a silent declaration of defiance while she stayed safely inside her house. John sat in his truck for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly as frustration coursed through him. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself before stepping out. The cold night air hit him like a slap, but it did little to cool the anger simmering beneath the surface. Walking over to Karen's porch, he knocked firmly on the door, his patience wearing thin. After a few moments, Karen finally answered. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression smug. "What now?" she asked, her tone dripping with irritation. "Your car is blocking my driveway," John said evenly, though his clenched jaw betrayed his composure. "Again?" Karen rolled her eyes dramatically. "Oh, come on. I'll move it when I'm ready. You can wait 5 minutes." "It's not about waiting," John replied, his voice rising slightly despite his best efforts to stay calm. "This has happened too many times. It's disrespectful, Karen. You're intentionally making things difficult. Her lips curled into a sneer. Maybe if you weren't such a show-off with all your fake war stories, people wouldn't mind parking. Here. Honestly, John, you act like you're some big hero, but we both know you're just another guy living in a cookie-cutter neighborhood. Her words struck a nerve deeper than anything she'd said before. For years, John had kept his military service private out of respect, for himself, for his fellow soldiers, and for the memories of those who hadn't come home. He didn't talk about his medals or his missions because he believed true heroes didn't need recognition. But now, standing face to face with someone who dismissed his sacrifices as nothing more than fake war stories, John felt something snap inside him. He stared at her, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made Karen falter for a split second. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward his house. There was no point arguing further. Karen clearly had no intention of understanding or apologizing. As he stepped onto his porch, he glanced once more at her SUV, its shiny surface gleaming under the dim streetlights. A plan began forming in his mind, one that would settle this dispute once and for all. Inside his house, John moved with purpose. He grabbed a flashlight, checked his phone for updates on local traffic laws just to be safe, and headed straight for the garage. The M41 Walker Bulldog tank loomed in the shadows, its massive frame taking up nearly half the space. John ran, his hand along its cold metal exterior, feeling the weight of history beneath his fingertips. This machine had been built for strength, resilience, and power, qualities that defined not only the tank, but also the man who owned it. As he prepared to fire up the engine, John paused for a moment, considering the implications of what he was about to do. He wasn't reckless by nature, nor did he want to create unnecessary drama in the neighborhood. But sometimes, actions spoke louder than words. If Karen refused to respect boundaries after countless polite requests, then perhaps it was time to remind her and everyone else exactly who they were dealing with. With a deep breath, John climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The rumble was unmistakable, a low growl that echoed through the quiet cul-de-sac like thunder. Neighbors peeked out their windows, curious about the sudden noise. Some recognized it immediately, while others exchanged puzzled glances. Within seconds, the tank emerged from John's garage, its treads crunching softly against the pavement as it rolled forward. John maneuvered the behemoth with practiced ease, positioning it directly behind Karen's SUV. Using the tank's sheer size and weight, he nudged the smaller vehicle gently forward, clearing the obstruction without causing any damage. Once the SUV was out of the way, John parked the tank right in front of his driveway, its presence impossible to ignore. Satisfied with his work, he climbed out and stood beside the machine, arms crossed as if daring anyone to challenge him. By now, the entire neighborhood was awake, drawn to their windows or front yards by the commotion. Kids gawked in awe, pointing excitedly at the towering tank. Adults whispered among themselves, torn between shock and admiration. Even Karen, who had been watching from her porch, seemed momentarily speechless. What are you doing?" she stammered, her voice trembling, with a mix of disbelief and outrage. "I'm protecting my property," John replied calmly, his tone firm but measured. "You've left me no choice," Karen spluttered, unable to form coherent sentences. "This is ridiculous. You can't park that thing there." "Watch me," John said simply, turning away. He didn't need to explain himself. Further, the tank spoke for itself, a symbol of strength, determination, and an unshakable resolve to stand up for what was right. For the first time since moving into the neighborhood, Karen found herself truly silenced. Gone was her usual bravado, replaced by wide-eyed panic as she realized the gravity of the situation. She stormed back into her house, slamming the door behind her. But the damage was done. Word of John's bold move spread quickly, becoming the talk of the neighborhood. Some cheered him on, praising his ingenuity and courage. Others shook their heads, wondering how things had escalated so far. But one thing was certain: Karen's reign of petty tyranny was over. As John stood beside his tank, watching the reactions unfold around him, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He hadn't wanted this confrontation, but he also knew it was inevitable. Sometimes standing your ground meant taking drastic measures, even if those measures involved a 15-ton military vehicle. And as the night wore on, John couldn't help but smile. Peace had been restored to the cul-de-sac, but this time on his terms. The revelation of John's tank didn't just shock Karen, it sent ripples through the entire neighborhood. By sunrise, the sight of the massive olive-green machine parked in front of John's driveway had become the centerpiece of every conversation. Neighbors gathered in small clusters on their lawns, sipping coffee and pointing toward the behemoth as if it were some mythical creature that had wandered into their sleepy cul-de-sac overnight. Kids raced around excitedly, pretending to drive imaginary tanks or climb aboard invisible turrets. Even those who rarely ventured outside found themselves drawn to the spectacle, unable to resist peeking out their windows for a closer look. Karen, however, was not amused. She paced back and forth inside her house, muttering furiously under her breath. Her perfect world, a place where she ruled with an iron fist disguised as HOA guidelines, had been shattered. The idea that John, someone she'd written off as mild-mannered and unassuming, could possess something so powerful and intimidating infuriated her. She couldn't believe he'd actually gone through with it. A tank? In their quiet suburban neighborhood. It was absurd, unthinkable. And yet there it was, undeniable proof that she'd underestimated him completely. Seething with anger, Karen finally emerged from her house, determined to confront John once more. She marched across the street, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, her face flushed red with indignation. When she reached John's yard, she found him calmly sitting on his porch, sipping coffee as if nothing unusual had happened. The tank loomed behind him like a silent guardian, its presence both awe-inspiring and slightly menacing. "What is this?" Karen shrieked, jabbing a finger toward the tank. "You can't just bring that thing out here. This isn't a war zone." John lowered his mug and looked at her evenly. "It's my property," he replied without raising his voice. "I can park it wherever I want, as long as it doesn't break any rules." But it's a tank," Karen spluttered, throwing her hands up in exasperation. "You're disrupting the entire neighborhood." "Am I?" John asked, raising an eyebrow. "Funny, because I don't recall anyone complaining when your SUV blocked my driveway repeatedly. If anything, I'd say this is restoring balance." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but quickly realized she had no counterpoint. Instead, she switched tactics, adopting a tone of mock concern. "Do you even have permission to use that thing? What if it damages the roads or scares people? You're being reckless." John chuckled softly, unfazed by her dramatics. "Relax, Karen. I'm not planning to take it cruising down Main Street. It's here to make sure my driveway stays clear, that's all." Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. "This is ridiculous. You're making a scene just to prove a point." "Maybe," John admitted with a shrug. "Or maybe I'm tired of being disrespected. Either way, it seems to be working." Furious and humiliated, Karen turned on her heel and stormed off, muttering threats about calling the authorities. But deep down, she knew she'd lost this round. For all her bluster and bravado, she couldn't compete with 15 tons of steel and history. As she retreated into her house, slamming the door behind her, John leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a small smile. Sometimes action spoke louder than words, and in this case the tank said everything he hadn't been able to articulate. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood buzzed with excitement. Some residents approached John cautiously, curious, to learn more about the legendary vehicle now stationed in their midst. "Is it really operational?" one neighbor asked, wide-eyed. "Of course," John replied with a grin. "Want to see?" Before the man could respond, John fired up the engine again, letting the deep rumble echo through the air. The sound sent shivers down spines, eliciting gasps of amazement from nearby onlookers. Kids cheered wildly, while adults exchanged impressed glances. One elderly woman even clapped her hands, declaring, "About time someone taught Karen a lesson." Others weren't quite ready to celebrate just yet. While many admired John's bold move, a few worried about potential fallout. "Do you think she'll call the cops?" one neighbor whispered nervously during a casual chat over the fence. "If she does, we'll deal with it," another replied, confidently. "Besides, what's she gonna say? My neighbor parked a tank in his driveway? Good luck getting anyone to take that seriously." As the day wore on, the novelty of the situation began to settle into something more profound. To some, the tank represented defiance, a symbol of standing up to bullies and refusing to back down. To others, it was a reminder of respect and boundaries, lessons everyone could benefit from learning. Whatever the interpretation, one thing was certain. John's quiet rebellion had sparked a shift in the neighborhood's dynamics. Even those who had previously stayed neutral in the ongoing feud between John and Karen found themselves siding with him. After years of enduring Karen's nitpicking and constant complaints, they saw this as a turning point, a chance to reclaim their sense of community from someone who had dominated it for far too long. Conversation shifted from gossiping about Karen's latest antics to sharing stories of how she'd targeted them in the past. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning against her. By evening, Karen's frustration had reached new heights. She spent hours pacing her living room, scrolling through her phone, and rehearsing arguments in her head. Every so often, she'd glance out the window at the tank, her scowl deepening with each passing minute. How dare John embarrass her like this? Didn't he realize how much power she wielded within the HOA? Surely there must be some rule he was violating, something she could use to regain control of the situation. Finally, unable to contain herself any longer, Karen picked up her phone and dialed the local police department. "Hello?" she began, her voice trembling with forced calmness. "I need to report an issue in my neighborhood. There's a tank parked on someone's driveway, and it's causing a disturbance. People are scared." The dispatcher listened patiently before responding. "Ma'am, did the tank cause any damage or threaten anyone?" "Well, no," Karen admitted reluctantly. "But still, it's inappropriate." "I see," the dispatcher said dryly. "We'll send an officer to assess the situation." Hanging up, Karen felt a flicker of hope. Surely the authorities would side with her. They'd force John to remove the tank, apologize profusely, and promise never to do it again. Everything would go back to normal, or rather her version of normal. What Karen failed to consider, however, was that John wasn't just any ordinary resident. He was a decorated veteran with connections and credibility. When the officers arrived the next morning, they recognized him immediately. After exchanging pleasantries and hearing his explanation, including photographic evidence of Karen's repeated violations, they sided with him wholeheartedly. "You've got every right to protect your property," one officer said firmly, shaking John's hand. "Just make sure you keep things safe and legal, okay?" "Absolutely," John replied with a nod. "Thanks for understanding." As for Karen, the incident marked the beginning of her downfall within the HOA. Humiliated and defeated, she struggled to maintain her authority in the face of growing opposition. Neighbors who had once feared her wrath now openly challenged her decisions, emboldened by John's example. Eventually, she sold her house and moved away, leaving behind a community that was stronger, more united, and infinitely less intimidated. For John, life returned to its usual rhythm, but with one key difference. His tank had earned him a newfound level of respect, not just as a neighbor, but as a symbol of resilience and integrity. And while he continued to live quietly, occasionally firing up the M41 for charity events or parades, he couldn't help but smile whenever someone referred to him as the guy with the tank. Little did he know, his actions had inspired others to stand up for themselves, not just in the cul-de-sac, but in life itself.